Today's session is on mode and load. So we will do talk about what mode is in data features. I'll talk a bit about what FTE is in data features, and I will pass over to Ruth, who will go through kind of the session status entity we have and some dormancy examples. So just reminding you the data model areas that we will be kind of referencing today. So we've got the students and the engagements beneath that, and then multiple student core sessions to cover the different kind of years that the students study. And then the session status entity and the reference period student load entity are hanging off the student core session. So they are returned every year. And we'll also briefly mention module as well. We'll come back to this data model as we step through the different areas, just to remind you where everything's sitting. So to start off with then, mode. So we have a student core session mode, which is unsurprisingly sitting on the student core session. That is the only kind of mode field we have. So when is mode not a mode? So currently in the student and the student alternative list, there are lots of codes that we wouldn't really consider modes. So they are actually, what we've done in data features is reduce that list to things that are only mode. So it's the method that the student is actually being taught their course. It's not some of the other stuff that's ended up in that field that perhaps isn't a mode. So what we've got in the student core session mode field, we've got the full-time, the other full-time, we've got a new code, which is for providers in England only, which is the accelerated full-time. So for those doing accelerated courses. Then we've got part-time, and then we've got a couple of part-time ones in Scotland as well. So the ones that are not mode in data features, obviously all of the FE data has come out of the record. So all of the FE modes we had in there are not needed anymore, so they've been removed. We had a couple of codes referencing sandwich. So those data items are kind of there, but they've been moved into different fields. So we've got the placement flag on the student core session and the sandwich on course, which kind of cover the same, the equivalent thing in data features. So writing up and dormancy, they have been moved to the session status entity. So that's, Ruth will go into more details later about what's actually in there and how you use them. So sabbatical is the final code in there, and that has actually gone. When we had a look at the way we were treating that, they were just being treated as dormant pretty much everywhere. And no one seemed to actually need that level of detail to be specified. So that code has gone. So just to kind of draw it up, it's a bit overwhelming. What I've basically got here is the student record codes on the right-hand side and the data features equivalent, just to show you where things are basically moved around. So we've got the full-times, the part-times all moving into the mode field. And as I said, the writing up and the dormancy codes have moved into the session status entity at the bottom left there. So sabbatical and FE codes have disappeared. That's why they've got the little circle symbol on. And the sandwich codes have been moved into a different field. And so the equivalent in the student alternative record, again, the full-time ones and part-time ones have been moved into mode, and the writing up has been moved into the session status entity, and sandwich into a different field. That's just to help kind of demonstrate to you where the current codes have moved to. So that is actually it in terms of, I'll go back on, mode and where it is in data features. I haven't actually drawn any examples up because it felt like that wasn't really going to help. So I know that's only been going a few minutes. Today's session I think probably is going to be a bit shorter than some of the others. But are there any questions around mode? well, has anyone got any questions around mode?
It's not looking like it just yet.
So FTE. Currently, we have a few different fields across student and student alternative. So we've got the FTE declared at a module level. We've got the StuLoad declared at instance level. We've got load year A and B for England and Northern Ireland only. And we've got an FTE method for Scotland. In student alternative, it's just the StuLoad. They don't have the other ones. They don't have modules or the other methods. So in terms of the equivalents then, so looking at StuLoad first, we have a reference period StuLoad entity. I'll talk in more details about what these are in a second, but we've got that entity. We've got a kind of predicted FTE field and a StuLoad field for the actual value. And those are the equivalents. So there's kind of two different methods, which I'll talk to you about on StuLoad. So module FTE is still module FTE. That one's not really changed much. But the next three, load year A and B and FTE method, don't exist in data features. With the change to the data features model, we don't need the load year A and B methodology because you fit it against the student course session and the dates that you're referring to. And therefore, we don't need the FTE method for providers in Scotland either. That has been removed for these features. So looking at what we do have, we have a reference period StuLoad entity. So that's recording the full-time equivalents of the FTE against the student course session and against every reference period that student course session falls into. So that could be 3 or 4 times, depending on the dates of our student course session. We've then got the predicted StuLoad. So that is at the beginning of the student course session returned to say this is what I think the StuLoad is going to be for that student. And we've got then the StuLoad field, which is indicating what the StuLoad actually was for that student. So in terms of where these sit on the model, the reference period StuLoad entity has obviously got its own entity on the right-hand side there. And the predicted StuLoad and the StuLoad, the actual StuLoad field are both sitting on the student course session. And I will explain to you what the two methods are then. So the per reference period StuLoad, which is that entity, this is applicable for England, Northern Ireland and Wales only. So it links to the student course session. The reason it's sitting off its own entity is because you can return it potentially 3 or 4 times. So every reference period that student course session spans across, you would return an FTE to show what that is over that period of time. And I've got an example towards the end of my section, so that will hopefully show you what I mean by that. In terms of the way this data might be used, it's used over kind of what's happened over the last 12-month period. So that is worth kind of knowing. It's actually used as a 12-month block. It's not necessarily going to be published in terms of that specific reference period FTE, and it's what's happening to that student over that 12-month period. So in terms of the fields we've got on there, we've got a reference period and we've got a year identifier so that it's really clear which kind of block of time that you're returning this student load for. And then we've got the StuLoad figure itself. So looking at the other method then, the predicted student load is for Scotland only. So again, this links to the student course session. You use the predicted student load field to tell us what you think is happening to that student. So if something happens during the student course session and their position changes or what they're going to do changes, you can update that predicted StuLoad to tell us what that is. And then you can record the actual value of what happened by the end of that student course session in the StuLoad field. So in terms of the field we're talking about here, they are on student course session. There are obviously lots of fields on student course session, so I've only listed the ones that are relevant for FTE. So we've got the predicted StuLoad field there, as I've been talking about, and then the actual StuLoad field. We also have an expected end date, which is for providers in Scotland only. And this is kind of tied into FTE so that we can we have some idea of when the provider thinks that student is finishing, and therefore what that period of time, the stu load that you're predicting, what that period of time is. So looking very briefly at the other thing then, so module FTE. So just a quick note on module FTE. Module data isn't required for approved providers or for postgraduate research students. So you wouldn't see it for those ones, but you would for everyone else. So we've got the module FTE sitting on the module entity, which you link to a student core session through the module instance entity. And so the module FTE indicates the proportion of the FTE that's actually attributable to that module. So it might vary a little bit if you've got, say, undergraduate students and postgraduate students studying the same module, because it's dependent on kind of what their overall study is. So looking at a couple of examples to hopefully highlight what we're talking about here. So this is the first example, and this is for, say it was for a provider in England, Northern Ireland and Wales, so it's the reference period entity method. So you can see here the years at the top. So we've got 1, 2 and 3 years. We've got the reference periods beneath that for each of those periods. And then we've got the reference period FTE that they will be returning there. So you can see in the first year, they're going to return 33 for the first reference period, 33 again for the second reference period, and then 34 to make up to 100. And this student's fairly standard full-time students, so it's the same in the second and third year. That's what you're doing. You're kind of returning each of these entity blocks against the reference period, breaking up the student core session accordingly. So looking at the kind of equivalent for Scotland, so they don't have the entity, they're returning the fields on student core session. So here in the first year, so in reference period 1, you'd return the predicted FTE student load as 100, because that's what the student is planned to do. In reference period 2, if that's still the same, then you wouldn't need to update it. It would kind of remain as 100. And then in reference period 3, they're finishing their student core session, so then you would also return the stu load field at the end here. And the same picture again for years 2 and years 3. Predicted stu load at the beginning in reference period 1 in this example, and then stu load by the end of reference period 3. So looking at a different example, so student core sessions that kind of don't nicely fit into reference periods as the first example was. So this one's going back to the England, Northern Ireland and Wales method in the entity. So there's only 2 student core sessions on here because I couldn't fit them on the page. So looking at the first one, this student starts somewhere through in the middle of reference period 2. And so they return just a little bit of that entity. So we've got here 20 FTE. Then reference period 3, they're studying more, so that's 35 for that FTE. And then reference period 1 of the following year, they're carrying on, so another 35. And then just a tiny bit to finish off their student core session, because their date doesn't come in until here, until this point, and we've got 10 in there. So overall, that will add up into 100, but broken down against the reference periods. And then again in their second year, so the students student core session 2, they've got the same pattern of study, so we break it up in the same way. So now looking at what Scotland would do for that. So again, student core sessions are going to be across reference periods. They don't start and end at the beginning and the end of them. So they've started in the middle way through reference period 2. At this point, you would return the predicted stu load, which at the moment we think is going to be 100. And then again, so reference period 3, that position doesn't change. Say reference period 1, the following year, that doesn't change either. And then the student kind of finishes off in the next reference period 2 of this year. And so at this point, they'd return the stu load field to say, actually, yes, it was definitely 100. So just to complicate this slightly, I've done one example where that isn't the same. So this is the second student core session of the student. So right at the beginning, in the middle of reference period 2 in this example, the predicted stu load will be 100. That's what the provider thought the student was doing. They may be in reference period 3, but then the student actually, say, dropped out or went dormant or whatever happened, and actually they didn't end up doing 100, the equivalent of 100 FTE, and so STU load, sorry. And so we dropped down the actual STU load value to 50. So by the end of the student course session, that's what actually happened with that student. That is everything I've got on FTE. Hopefully going through a couple of examples to show that. Laura, I'm going to pause there. Are there any questions on FTE?
Yeah, we've got one question, I think, relating to like earlier on at the beginning. How is accelerated, I think that's full-time mode defined? Are the other mode definitions unchanged?
The other mode definitions are unchanged, and I'm just going to double check what the accelerated definition is. So it's only for providers in England, and so we have taken a definition that was on the website. So it's the definition in the so the regulatory framework defines an accelerated course as a qualification at say level 6 of the framework for higher education qualification, where the number of academic years to be completed is at least one fewer than would normally be the case for that course. So it's done faster than you would have expected. And so there are a variety of terms that are kind of used to this: accelerated, fast track, just a 2-year, or compressed or condensed, or an intensive course, all of those kind of things referring to that. So it's kind of assumed to be one less year than it would be to do what is a normal kind of full-time course. But yeah, the other definitions are all the same as now. Okay then, shall I pass over to Ruth then? If there are any more questions, we could come back to them at the end.
Yeah, absolutely.
There we go. Oh, you should be able to see that now.
Yeah, that's perfect.
As Rachel said, I'm going to take you through the session status entity and how that works and what we're recording in that entity, and then run through a few examples of dormancy under different scenarios and how that would be returned. So just a quick reminder then. The session status entities you can see on the model hangs off the student course session, and it's recording where that student course session changes status to one of the ones that we're interested in, with an associated date from which that status applies. So the statuses we're interested in, we've got 4 within this entity. I'll skip active for now and come back to it, but what we're interested in here is, has the student moved to a dormant status? So are they inactive and they're not actively studying on that student course session? Are they intercalating? And by intercalating here, we mean intercalating at a different provider. Because in effect, that would mean that they were inactive or dormant at the original provider. And finally, are they writing up? So for postgraduate research students, we want to record when they move to a writing up status and with the date associated with that. We also have that active status. But if I go on to some of the general principles for this entity, we don't expect the provider to return an active status for every student course session that's active. We only need them to return active where one of those other statuses has applied. So if the student was never dormant, intercalating, or writing up during a student course session, the provider doesn't have to just say that they're active for every single student course session. We've got an example on this later, but would only apply where, for example, they moved to dormant status and then restarted study within the same student course session. The next principle, if a student is returned with a status of dormant or intercalating, the provider doesn't need to return that student again. They've told us that student is taking a break in learning, so we won't expect to see them in the subsequent reference periods until that student either restarts study or they tell the provider they're not going to return to study. And we've got an example of that one later as well. And finally, all session status updates must continue to be returned throughout a student course session. So if they move to a dormant status, for example, at the beginning of a student course session, we'd expect to see that status be returned until the student course session has been closed, so we can see that status in each reference period that it applies. To talk a bit then about writing up before we move on to the examples, the status valid from date, as with the other session status updates, must reflect the date on which the student moved to the writing up status. The way that writing up works slightly differently to the other statuses that we're recording is that it must continue to be returned across multiple reference periods, because that's applicable to writing up in a way it isn't with dormancy. So like I said, once they're recorded as dormant, they don't have to return that student again. Whereas if a student's writing up, they have to continue to be returned with that session status reflecting the original date that they moved to writing up. So that date could therefore be in a previous student course session if they were writing up across multiple student course sessions. In relation to FTE, we also continued the same guidance that we have in the student record now, where we say that writing up students would have an FTE of 10 if they're writing up for a full year. So as Rachel's gone through, for providers in Scotland, they were writing up for a full year's student course session, they'd have 10 as their predicted natural FTE for that student course session. If it was a provider in England, Northern Ireland or Wales, we'd expect to see that split up between the different reference periods. So what I've got now are 7 different scenarios of students going dormant or intercalating under different circumstances. Scenario 1 then, a student goes dormant partway through a student course session. And as I said, the session status entity is recording where they change status during a student course session. So that's where that entity is going to come into play. The student was studying on a student course session. They would have had a student course session returned to us. At the point that they moved to a dormant status, a session status entity would be returned. The status change to field would say be O2, saying that they've moved to a dormant status, and the valid from date would show the date from which they become dormant. So starting off nice and straightforward, student becomes dormant, the session status records that they're dormant and from when. Just to note that this is partway through the student course session. If at the end of the student course session, the student is still dormant, we'd expect to see that student course session closed with an end date and a reason for ending of interrupted, as they're still not actively studying. They've interrupted their studies. Scenario 2 is similar because we've got a student that goes dormant partway through a student course session, but the difference with this one is that the provider knows that they're going to be dormant for at least the next year. So they know that that student is not going to undertake any more activity on this student course session, in which case they can close down that student course session saying that the student has moved to a dormant status. They don't need to keep it open because they know there's no more activity on that session. So in this example, what they do is you'd have that reason for student course session ending of interrupted and a student course session end date. We'd still expect to see that session status update, again, showing that they've moved to a dormant status and with the applicable date, because the session status still has to record each time that the student status moves to dormant. So we still expect to see that in this example. And as I've said before, as the student course session has ended with that status of dormant, we don't expect to see the student again until they either resume study or will not be returning to their engagement, because the providers told us the student's taking a break, they're dormant from this point. Scenario 3, I've mentioned this when we were talking about the active status. So a student goes dormant and resumes study within the same student course session. It starts off the same as our other scenarios. You would have one session status update, the status valid from date indicating the date that they moved to dormant, and a status change to of O2 again dormant. So starts off the same as the other two scenarios. Student has moved to a dormant status on that date. However, in this scenario, the student then returns to study. So that's when we'd expect to see an additional session status update. This time with a status change to of 01, indicating that they are back to being active. And again, the date reflecting the point from which that applies. So just to demonstrate then that, as I've said, the active status only needs to be returned where one of the other statuses has applied and the student then moves to an active status. And you can have multiple session status updates within a student core session where that reflects the student's activity. Quick note on this one as well. This way of returning the student would only work if they resume study against the same associated session year and course. So if the student's period of dormancy meant that when they returned they were on a different session year or they'd switched cohorts, then they would need a new student core session to reflect that. So we went through that example in one of the previous sessions when we were looking at session years. Scenario 4 then, a student completes a student core session and is known to be going dormant. So in this example, rather than going dormant partway through a student core session, the student completes their year of study as expected, but at the end of that year of study, when the provider returns that information to us, they know the student is not expected to come back the following year. So say they're returning, the student is finishing their student core session in reference period 3, but they know that they're not expecting to come back in the autumn to start their next year of study. So the provider can tell us that at that point at the end of that student core session. And this is how they do that. So the students finish that student core session as expected. So it would have the end date of the point that they finished that student core session and a reason for ended as it's ended as expected. It hasn't ended because they've interrupted or withdrawn. They've done that year as expected. They're just then going dormant after that. But at the point that they return that, they could also send us the session status update. As with the others, the status change to would be 02 for dormant, and the status valid from date would be the date from which the student is dormant. So in this example, that's the day after the end of the student course session. And what that's telling us in the data is the students finished this student course session, but we're not expecting them to come back in the next reference period. So as with the other examples, we don't need them to return that student again until they do come back to study or the provider knows they will not be coming back to study. Scenario 5 is similar in terms of the student's activity. The difference here is the point at which the provider knows that the student is going dormant. So in both scenario 4 and 5, the student completes 1 year of study and doesn't come back for the next year of study. In scenario 4, the provider knew that at the point they were returning the end of the first student course session. In scenario 5, they didn't. So they returned in a previous reference period, they returned that student course session on the screen there with a reason for ended and an end date. And at that point, they were expecting the student to come back the subsequent year. So they didn't indicate to us that the student was moving to a dormant status because they didn't know. However, when it comes to the next reference period, the student hasn't come back to study. They need to then tell us that that student has moved to a dormant status because we need to have that actively confirmed in the data. They didn't tell us at the end of the last student course session, so they're going to have to tell us at the start of this one. So what they've returned then, they'd have to return a new student course session. We need them to record the student's move to dormant. It can have the start date at the point at which the student was expected to return. So that might be the start date of the associated session year. If they have a session year, if not, be a year after the start of the previous student course session. And then again, as with all of these, we'd expect to see a session status entity returned. The status change to would be 02 of dormant, and the status valid from date would be the point from which that dormant status applies. So in this case, that is the day after the end of the previous student course session. That's the point that the student was last active, was the end of the previous student course session. So the status valid from date is the day after that, the point from which they were dormant. So those two scenarios then, just to demonstrate that in both the students undertaking the same activity, but we know that it can vary in terms of when the provider is aware that the student's going dormant, particularly between years of study. So it'd be returned in a slightly different way depending on if the provider knows at the end of the last student course session, or they don't know until the student doesn't come back at the start of the next one. Scenario 6 then, I've mentioned a couple of times that once a student course session is closed as dormant, the provider doesn't need to return them again unless they resume study or they know they will not be resuming study. So in this scenario, what we're saying is, in a previous reference period, the provider has returned the student to us as dormant. They've already told us that this student is dormant, but however many reference periods later, the student informs the provider, actually, I'm not coming back to study on this engagement. And so the provider needs to tell us that. They already told us the student was dormant in a previous student course session, and the student hasn't undertaken any new activity. So in this scenario, we wouldn't expect to see a new student course session. What we'd expect to see is a leaver record returned. So that would consist of an end date. That's the same definition of an end date in any other scenario, so the last date of the student's activity. So in this scenario, that would be in a previous reference period, backdated to the point that they were last active. And a reason for ending. So that would be whatever the appropriate reason for ending is for that engagement. This is also the point that they would return any qualifications if the student was awarded an exit award at that point. So if the student's reported as dormant in one reference period and subsequently tells the provider that they're not returning, we don't need a new student course session for those, we just get a leaver entity. Final scenario then is a student intercalating at another provider. So I've mentioned already that that is one of the statuses recorded in the session status entity, and that applies only to where the student intercalates elsewhere, so at a different provider. We would not expect providers to use this where the student is intercalating at the same provider. So in this scenario, the student completes one student course session as expected, and the provider knows that for their next year, they're going to be intercalating elsewhere. So like with the dormancy scenario, we'd expect to see the student course session closed with an end date and reason for ending of ended, as it's just ended as expected. And then we would see a session status update, this time with a status changed to of 03 for intercalate. And again, the valid from date being the day after the student course session. That's the point from which they're no longer studying at the provider who's returning them here, and they will be returned by the provider that they're intercalating to. So the reason that intercalating between providers is recorded in this entity is that essentially for the provider who returns what's on your screen now, the student is no longer actively studying at them. They're effectively dormant for that provider. So like with when the provider records that the student has gone dormant, once they've told us that they're intercalating off at another provider, this provider does not need to return that student again until they come back to them. So they're not expected to return a record for the student while they're not studying with them, as long as they've told us the student's off to intercalate somewhere else. So that is all of the scenarios that I was going to run through.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.